with the release of What the Waters Left Behind Scars earlier this year, I figured it would be a good time to go back and to take a look at the Onetti brothers' body of work in the horror genre to date. So, who are the Onetti brothers? The Onetti brothers, Luciano and Nicolas Onetti, come from Argentina. Luciano Onetti directed his first film Sonno Profondo, also known as Deep Sleep, in 2011. It was this very experimental kind of art film that captured almost perfectly the look and the feel of a 1970s giallo. He wrote it, directed it, shot it, composed the music, and even starred in the fucking thing, whilst his brother Nicolas Onetti produced and worked more on the kind of business side of things. Next was Francesca in 2015, another throwback giallo. And after that, Nicolas Onetti would then go on to co-directing films with his brother. And from that point onwards, the two of them became intertwined in this kind of joint creative partnership, the Onetti brothers. So what this is going to be is, in my opinion, a ranking of the 5 Onetti brothers films to date, from their worst to their best. Although, without spoiling anything, I will say I personally am a huge fan of the Onetti's films, and I think everything that they've done so far has been worth watching in its own way. They just make such very unique films. There's no one else out there that's really doing anything quite like these guys. Now, for the purposes of this list, I'm taking just the 5 feature films that have been directed by at least one of the Onetti brothers. I'm not going to include the anthology films that they've been involved with, because in those cases their involvement is usually that maybe Nicolas Onetti is either the creative director, or that he or Luciano has only directed just a portion of the film itself, such as the wraparound. So, this list is just the 5 films that they've done since Sonno Profondo. Sonno Profondo in 2011, Francesca in 2015, directed just by Luciano Onetti, What the Waters Left Behind 1 and Abracadabra, directed by Luciano and Nicolas Onetti, and then What the Waters Left Behind Scars, which is the only one of the 5 films that's just directed by Nicolas Onetti. So, let's get stuck in. Starting at number 5, Sonno Profondo, also known as Deep Sleep. Now, Sonno Profondo made quite a splash when it came out. It was the first film that the Onetti brothers made, and it got a lot of love for perfectly capturing the look and feel of a 70s Italian giallo film in a way that not really any other film had quite managed up until that point. For me, I think this is the film that most exemplifies the fact that Luciano Onetti is a guy that deals almost exclusively in these kind of arty, abstract visuals, and in style over substance. It looks and feels great as capturing a particular feel, but it's not really too much fun to sit through. It's very experimental, the whole film is shot entirely point of view, and it's got probably about a dozen lines of dialogue at max. It's an art film, and for me, that means that it's one that you can appreciate on some level, but which just isn't much fun to actually watch. But I think, even as my least favourite Onetti brothers film, I still think just purely artistically, it is an interesting film and it is definitely worth a watch, although probably it's not one that you'll be coming back to too often. Number 4, Francesca. Now, Sonno Profondo was Luciano Onetti's calling card film, but Francesca is probably his most well-known work. It's generally the film that most people point to as being the best of his filmography, and it's one of the most perfect distillations of the essence of a pure giallo and a flawless capturing of the kind of look and feel of a 70s Italian film. So, why isn't this one higher then? Well, for me, the issue that I've got with this film is that visually, stylistically, again, it's great. You can't fault the look of the film, you can't fault the fact that the music in this is just top-notch giallo pastiche. But my issue is that for me, there's a lot of things that I love about giallos, but a lot of people, critics or fans, even Luciano Onetti himself, often points to giallos as being just the ultimate in style over substance, that they're all about visuals and atmospheres. And one of the recurring things that gets brought up is the fact that in a lot of cases, giallos don't make the hugest amount of sense, or that they don't really rely too much on actually having strong plots. And personally, I don't think that's the case at all, because alongside the colours and the imagery and the style, one of the things that I personally think is the most enjoyable about giallos is that they're actually really well written. They've got very dense and complex plots. All of my favourite giallos have got really great, twisty, involved stories, as well as great acting and very cool and memorable characters. So I think that the problem with Francesca is that it's a giallo homage that has been designed with the eye of the guy that made Sonno Profondo. It's a film that's been made by a director who's looked at giallos and copied only the very surface layer, just the most easily imitatable elements of style and direction and iconography, whilst missing out on the really important stuff underlying all of that. Because you end up with what feels like a collection of giallo music videos sandwiched loosely together. Set pieces designed around random visual ideas that don't really ever connect. You don't really ever get the feeling like you're watching an actual story that's progressing. There's just way too many superfluous, show-offy, weird, trippy sequences that don't work because they're so obviously just there for their own sake. Because Luciano Onetti basically likes doing that kind of stuff. Out of context, I think that those sequences get quite wearing quite quickly. And what it all really comes down to is that rather than being what you expect it to be, which is an art-housey giallo film, Francesca is ultimately a giallo-flavoured art film, and I think there's a big difference between those two things. Number 3 is going to be a What the Waters Left Behind film, and I think I'm probably going to have to give it to the first one. So, the Onetti brothers went from doing these amazing giallo pastiches to making a film that captures, in an equally well-observed detail, the look and feel of an early 2000s gritty, hardcore backwoods torture film. Luciano Onetti went from writing note-perfect giallo music to doing imitation Steve Jablonsky Chainsaw Massacre music for What the Waters Left Behind, and it's every bit as fitting. Now, I know these films don't really get as much love as the Onetti's giallo stuff, but I really think there's something that's more straightforward and honest about this particular film, that is not something that's really been over-designed to within an inch of its life in the way that I think Francesca is, and I think that makes it feel a little bit less kind of suffocatingly pastiche-y. Now, I love giallo films, but at the same time, I also love early 2000s hardcore horror, and I think that this is a great evocation of that era. Nasty, brutal, and direct, but at the same time as you'd expect, directed with an eye for a very striking image. It's also the first film where Nicolas Onetti was brought on to co-direct, and I think you get a film that feels a little bit less kind of monomaniacally obsessed with just getting every single tiny detail just right. It feels like Nicolas Onetti brings with him that missing level of energy that I think helps to take Luciano Onetti's natural kind of art house style and translate it into something that works on just a more purely entertaining level, whilst still looking absolutely fantastic all the way through. I think it's these films that show that the Onettis are not just one-trick ponies, and that they can actually branch out and make other types of films and play with different types of horror atmospheres. Number 2, What the Waters Left Behind, Scars. This is the sequel that actually ups the original, I think. And what that really comes down to is the fact that, as strange as it might sound, I actually think Nicolas Onetti is the better director of the two brothers. And this is, to date, the only full-length film that he's actually directed. I think just overall it looks better than part 1. It moves faster, it's got more energy, a better pace, and it just cuts to the action a lot quicker. There's also that sense of returning to some place that's almost mythical, where you get to realise we've got a new group of good-looking victims turning up to Epic When. There's an actually quite a chilling plot point from part 1 that gets picked up as well that I think helps bump this one up a little more, and the nastiness in this just really hits as hard as it did in the first one, whilst being a little more visually discreet. Now, I might have given the impression when I spoke about this film in my review that I didn't actually care for it. Now, that's not the case at all. It's more just that I think as a franchise, I feel that there's a potential for the What the Waters series that I kind of hoped would be in the sequel that I've still really yet to see fully capitalised on. But for what they are, I actually think both of these films are entertainingly grimy, nasty horror films. They both have got their own pros and cons, but I think in terms of which is just more enjoyable overall, I think part 2 is just a better made film. It's this really stylish and well put together backwards slasher film that's got one of the most amazing locations that you'll ever see in any horror film. Which takes us to number 1, which is of course my favourite Onetti brothers film, Abracadabra. Like I said at the start, I think all of the Onetti brothers films are worth watching. Sonno Profondo and Francesca for me are a little bit too abstract, but they are really nice to look at. The What the Waters Left Behind films are fun, good-looking, gritty exploitation films, but I think there's one genuinely really great film made by the Onettis, and that film is Abracadabra. This is a film that's directed by both brothers, and it's the point at which they both work together most effectively. You can feel Luciano Onetti's eye for visuals and images at work in this, you get his gorgeous music, but you also get Nicolas Onetti's pace and energy and his sense of structure. In a way, they're a perfect yin and yang, and Abracadabra once again captures the 70s Italian Euro horror look flawlessly, but at the same time, it's also got a great plot. It doesn't just languish in these show-offy visuals for their own sake or get lost in these kind of self-indulgent set pieces, it just really moves. It pays off with a film's worth of mystery and intrigue with a stand-up and cheer ending that, for a film about a magician, is the perfect cinematic magic trick. Because all of the Onetti brothers films show that they're phenomenal technicians. They're the masters of visuals and styles and of capturing era-specific looks. But Abracadabra really shows that they can do all of these things in a way that doesn't feel gimmicky or self-indulgent, all whilst telling a story and making a great film. I think Abracadabra is just their absolute triumph, not just the best Onetti brothers film, but one of the best and most perfect 1970s throwback films in its own right. Not just an act of imitation, but just a phenomenal film all around. So, that's my ranking of the Onetti brothers films to date. Hopefully, there'll be a lot more great films to come from them in the future. Whatever type of films they choose to do next, I for one will always be excited for more Onetti brothers goodness, because it feels like they've only really just got started doing what it is that they do. So, whether or not you're familiar with the Onetti's work, whether you agree with my rankings of their films if you are, or if you like the look of their stuff if you're not, hopefully I'll see you back here in the future to talk about their next film when that eventually gets released. And let's hope it's their best one yet.
Punta de pie entra. No. Vamos de vuelta. No, entré en punta de pie, Gus. No, sí, ¿cómo que no? Mirá, yo voy a cambiar. Sí. Vamos. No, espera. Chicos, silencio, por favor, dale que nos vamos a terminar.